It is so good to see this man back in action. He's 19-year-old Alireza Firouzja, the world's #1 Blitz player, and yes, you heard that right. He sits above Magnus, above Hikaru, and above 2900, as you can see on screen here. And he's one of my absolute favourite players, and I believe he'll be world champion one day. He's that good. So he's playing in this Airthings Masters tournament, which is a rapid play event, and it's part of the Champions Chess Tour. So there's a whole series of events coming this year, and it's being launched by chess.com, who acquired the Play Magnus group last year. So it's all come together into one event now. Bigger prize money, bigger commentators, bigger action, everything like that. So this game here was in the kind of qualifying stages. Alireza had white, Gukesh black, 10 minutes plus 2 seconds on the clock each. Let's see what happened. So e4 from Alireza, that's his favourite. c5 Sicilian defence. Now these knights develop, and we see bishop to b5, which is the Rossolimo variation. And now e6 was played, many different moves. You know, g6 is a popular response. Alireza castles, and now this knight comes to e7, defending this one, and so Alireza slides this rook over, and after a6, he retreats the bishop. Now I mention this because sometimes you see white taking there and shattering the pawn structure, but you wouldn't want to take there when it can be recaptured with the knight, because if you're going to give up your bishops, you want to get a shattered pawn structure in compensation. So now d5 from black, striking at the centre. Alireza captures, and we see the knight taking back here. Sometimes the queen recaptures, but you never go with the pawn because you don't want to start opening up your king. Now d4 takes some space. We see the knight hopping back. Looks a bit counterintuitive to underdevelop that piece, but it does open up the eyes of the queen, as I'm drawing here. Pressures on that pawn, and so Alireza covers it. And it begs the question, well, what happens if knight g4 now comes, hitting this one? But actually it's not good, because then bishop g5 can come, hitting the queen. And without going through loads of detail, because you're moving this same piece a lot of time, not developing your pieces, it's bad for black. So I'm going to jump back here, carry on with the game where Gukesh just develops, very good play. And now c4 from Alireza takes more central space and then prepares to develop this knight. And after castles, that's exactly what we see. Now we see this tension resolved in the centre. The knight recaptures, and the most common move here is bishop to d7, but instead we see knight e5. Couple ideas to it as I'm drawing. One, you pressure the pawn on c4, but two, you also look to hop to knight g4, pressure this bishop. So Alireza covers that one. Now the bishop develops, and we see the rook coming to the c-file. Very classic idea, because this pawn's going to need some defence at the right moment, and black already starts to target. Queen b3 covers, queen c7 attacks again. So the knight now hops to a4, opens the rook to cover, and threatens this knight b6 hop. And that's why we see the rook now nudge to the d-file, anticipating knight b6. But knight b6 doesn't come. Why not? Well, this time you're running into bishop to c5, and this is good for black, because you're hitting the knight on b6. So takes on d7 looks very logical, of course. The rook can recapture, but then the problem is this knight on d4. Now you can bring a rook to defend, or you can play like this. This is one of the top lines. But after black captures, knight recaptures. Now black gets to double on the d-file, and because of that pressure down the only open file, actually black's the one doing well out of the opening here. So this is the problem with hopping knight b6 too prematurely. So instead, Alireza goes queen to b6, and now we see Gukesh just nudge back his queen, and his position looks a bit passive here, but he's got an idea in mind. By leaving the queens on the board, he's now threatening to take that knight on a4 with his bishop, and then look at things like bishop c5 once the knight relinquishes control here. And that's why queen a5 comes, covers the knight, but also watches out for the bishop c5 stuff. Again, there's now a threat to go knight b6, so the queen nudges over, the knight hops in, and now the bishop can hit this diagonal because the queen moved away, and Gukesh is just so well prepared now, as we'll see. Because after Alireza nudges his rook across here, we then see this bishop coming into e4, which is the best move on the board. But it really begs the question, what would happen here if white went bishop to f4? Because this knight is pinned to the queen. and it's going to be attacked a lot of times. You know, the rook's now hitting here, the queen is hitting it. Well, here's the trick. You can go knight f3 check, and after the pawn captures, the queen takes here, and you even give a second piece. But the trick in all of this is knight takes on e4. So you're threatening a massive check here, followed by a mate. And there are two ways to cover it. One, you could go like this, but then you're running into bishop f6. And there's this huge problem with the attack on the knight and the fact it's pinned to the rook. You're actually going to drop a piece. Or in this position, you could actually chop off this knight, queen recaptures, but again, you've got all the same problems with this knight dropping by force. You can try bishop g2, but the queen just moves. You can try defending, but then the bishop comes. Long story short, this knight will always drop because of this issue with the pin down the file. So quite a long line, but an important one to show that bishop f4 is not working. And as a result, Alireza goes for bishop to g5, attacking the knight that's defending the bishop and therefore threatening to capture it. But he's overlooked a tactic here which Gukesh pounces on, so well prepared. So can you guess what Gukesh played in this position here? So the move he played was rook takes on d4. After the rook recaptures, well, here's the idea. The knight backtracks to c6, and they say that these are some of the hardest moves to see in chess, a retreating knight move. Now you're hitting these two with a fork, and after the queen comes back to defend the rook, well, then you're getting double whammied with bishop to b4, now hitting another rook down here. And this is where Alireza says, you know what? Eat my queen. I don't care. I'm the #1 blitz player. I know how to create counterplay. Now, just to mention, he didn't have to do this. He could have got queen e3 there. That's the computer's top move. And okay, it gets very complicated. Black should be a bit better. But he takes here. Now black is even a lot more better, but it's complex. Because after the bishop takes, rook takes, this pawn takes, and okay, you've exposed the black king a bit. Plus you now take this bishop here. So what's white got for the queen? Well, you've got rook and bishop. Shouldn't technically be enough. You know, that's 8 points, the queen's 9 points, but there are chances. So the knight comes to e5. And the idea here is to activate the knight, but also you cover now this d7 hop, because there could be an idea to fork these two pieces. And it begs the question, well, what if f4 to drive that knight away and then land the fork? But then there's, say, queen c7, you can counterattack this knight. So there are ways to kind of worm out of it for black. Anyway, so we didn't see that one. c5 was played. Takes some space, prepares to be supported as I'm drawing on the board here, set up the pawn chain, and also opens this bishop, plus the knight could make use of that square. Different ideas. So the rook comes to d8, and this is a very thematic idea. Trade off one of those rooks so that they can't then coordinate together in a powerful way. Now queen c7 hits the pawn, b4 defends, and now here Gukesh, his best idea was to push that f-pawn, and it's a really important one to remember that if you've got the queen against the minor or major pieces, try and expose the enemy king, because that's where the queen is at its best, delivering checks, trying to pick off unprotected pieces or pawns. But Gukesh starts with knight to c6 instead, but now Alireza gets a bit of an initiative. He kicks the queen, the pawn is attacked, it's defended, and now Gukesh goes slightly wrong. His best here was queen to c1, invading, pinning this bishop, then preparing to hop the knight at the right moment. But instead he goes knight d4 immediately, and now the queen has to actually babysit this knight because it's attacked by the rook. Or after knight c4 from Alireza, and I'm just drawing a couple of possible jumps from that knight, you can go e5 here to protect it, but then the problem is, although you free up the queen, you've now given up this big f5 square, and that's dangerous, because if a knight lands there, you're going to be boxing in the king. There are checkmating ideas. Now this is where Alireza, he snaps off this pawn. He could have actually started with knight e3 as a good move here. But okay, he takes the pawn, understandable. This one's now weak as well, eyed by the bishop from afar. And now queen c1, finally Gukesh gets that attacking move in, and he's got these ideas now of knight e2 check and then picking up this bishop. So knight e3 was played, it covers the bishop, and again, the best move here was push that f-pawn, try and rip open the king. But queen e1 was played, still ideas of knight e2 check, but then you can pick up the f2 pawn with the queen. But here we see great counterplay from Alireza again. His blitz skills coming through. Pawn to c6. And without clicking through all the lines, basically, if black lands this check here, the best you can actually do is force a perpetual. You can't go for winning chances. But when you take here, this keeps winning chances alive for black. And black is still a bit better in this position. Now knight f5 comes, so you've cut the king's escape square. There are now mating threats. Not immediately, but if the knight ever moves, come back to d4, then you deliver the mate. You could look at this kind of stuff, and so that's why h5 gives the king some room. Rook d7 now from Alireza, so covers the d file once again, stops the knight from hopping, and so queen b1 was played, hits one of these aggressive pieces, and Alireza doesn't move it. It's very well placed. He doesn't want to allow knight d4, so he goes on the counter attack, and this is where we see a liquidation. So black takes here, the pawn recaptures, then you see this one drop, but Alireza wins a pawn. However, black is still better, because although white's got this outside passed pawn, we see Gukesh now activate the queen, come behind the pawn, and then he's able to get his own pawns marching. The queen covers here, really well placed. And after g3, king f6, Alireza's really reduced to waiting in this position. He can't actually advance this pawn without losing it. So e4 now played, great move. Rook e2 hits the queen, sets a trap as well, because if black takes, then you take here, and this is actually an immediate draw. If the rook is taken, you take the queen, and so on. It's just a drawing position. So we see queen b1 instead, rook e3, king e5, and after king g2, Gukesh blinks. He had a winning continuation here, and the best move to play was pawn h4. f4 also good, but h4 absolutely the best, because if the pawn captures, well, look at this. I mean, these pawns are just absolutely deadly. Where does the rook go? Rook c3 is the best move, but then you carry on ripping open that king. And again, you just can't be capturing. Otherwise, you check, pick up an entire rook. If you don't capture, well, what do? Queen b2 is coming anyway, and you're in tons of trouble. So it's just a completely winning combination. And coming back here, if you don't take the pawn on h4, I mean, say you go rook c3 immediately, well, still we just rip open the position. If takes with this one, again, we've got the check. If you take with the rook, then f4 still comes. It's just game over. So a big opportunity missed by Gukesh. He went king d4, and Alireza doesn't need asking twice to stop the threat. He pushes that pawn. Now queen b4, bishop e2, targets this one, and after king e5, we now see this liquidation of pawns, and the f-pawn drops, and suddenly the game is turning. f4 takes, king goes, but who is really now better? Because the e-pawn is dropping, king e5, Alireza wins it, and suddenly Gukesh is scrambling to force a perpetual now. Look at the times on the clock, by the way. So king f6 played, bishop f3, preparing to now run this pawn. We see the queen move, the rook hits the queen d3, rook g4, the king is now cut, and this is getting dangerous. Queen d2 played, h5 on the board, queen c1, rook g6 check, king goes, bishop checks, king goes, bishop back, and now Gukesh makes a mistake. So he should go something like king f5 here. It keeps tabs on the rook, stops the pawn from pushing. But what we see in the game is queen to c3. And you can't blame the guy, he's so low on time, looks natural, you're hitting this bishop. However, it's a mistake, because rook g4 check, which Alireza plays, the king goes, and now there was a winning continuation here of pawn to h6. And it's just a beautiful idea, because how do you stop the pawn? Now the king is completely cut, so the king can't stop the pawn. The white king cannot be checked by the black queen, so you're never going to deliver a perpetual. Well, what happens if you drop back and just prepare to pick up the pawn, right? Well, here's the trick. You kick it on anyway, and it cannot be captured, or then you deliver this skewer and you win the game. And if you're not capturing the pawn, well, what else to do? If you try and move the queen, well, we land this one, that's game over. And if you try and move the king, again, we just see the bishop supporting the pawn, and then the rook is about to come next move, shut the trap. You know, this is a completely lost endgame. The queen's dropping, and then these two will win the game out for white. So a very nice idea to win the game, push the h-pawn, but Alireza misses it. Again, they're so low on time. because now after rook g3, there's queen d4, the pawn goes finally, but in this line you can come behind the pawn with the queen. And yes, the rook goes here, looks like it should be winning, but actually there's a perpetual. Now you check, king goes, and you just start checking, and white cannot escape these ones. Anytime you step to the g file, well, you can check from here. Anytime you step here, you can do all this stuff, and so on and so forth. You just cannot escape, and in this position, a draw was agreed. If you enjoyed this one, then do please hit that like button, really helps me out. And if you want to see an exceptional game from Cagnus Marlson, check out the video on screen. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.